Ever wondered what you'd wear if you suddenly time traveled to medieval Europe? How would your Instagram-worthy outfit come together without Amazon Prime or fast fashion? Number 6, the final touch, embellishment and decoration. Did medieval folks just rock plain, boring clothes? Absolutely not. While peasants had simpler garments, anyone who could afford it added flourishes to their clothing that would make today's fashion influencers green with envy. For the wealthy, clothing became a walking billboard of status and wealth. Gold and silver threads weren't just for show, they literally showed how much money you had. Embroidery wasn't merely pretty, it was practically a medieval flex. Ladies of noble houses spent countless hours creating intricate designs, often telling stories or displaying family symbols through their needlework. But wait, there's more. Buttons made from precious metals, carved bone, or exotic materials weren't just functional, they were the medieval equivalent of designer labels. The more elaborate your buttons, the more important you clearly were. Some noble outfits featured dozens of tiny buttons, not because they needed that many, but because they could afford them. Tablets painted with egg tempera and precious minerals created pigments for designs on fabrics. Craftspeople mixed these colors with binders like egg white or gum arabic to create paints that could adhere to fabric. The most luxurious outfits incorporated actual gemstones and pearls sewn directly onto the garment. Even ordinary folk found ways to beautify their clothing. Simple embroidery with locally available colored threads, particularly around collars, cuffs, and hems, brightened up otherwise plain garments. Clever stitching techniques created texture and visual interest without requiring expensive materials. Applique work, where pieces of contrasting fabric were sewn onto the base garment, provided another affordable way to customize clothing. For special occasions like weddings or religious ceremonies, even peasants would add special touches to their best clothes. Sprigs of herbs or seasonal flowers might be tucked into belts or sewn temporarily onto garments. These natural embellishments served double duty. They looked and smelled nice while potentially warding off insects and masking body odors. The most stunning medieval garments combined multiple decoration techniques. Imagine a noblewoman's gown with pearls outlining the neckline, embroidered sleeves depicting biblical scenes, and tablet woven trim in gold thread around the hem. These pieces weren't just clothes, they were wearable art that took months or years to complete. Number 5, construction from fabric to garment. How long would it take to make a single shirt if you had to do everything by hand? In medieval times, the answer was measured in days, not hours. Construction began with careful planning. Fabric was precious, wasting even a small piece could represent days of labor down the drain. Medieval tailors developed cutting layouts that utilized nearly every scrap of fabric. These masters of efficiency would carefully chalk their cutting lines directly onto the fabric before making a single cut. Unlike today's paper patterns, medieval garment plans were based on body measurements and geometric principles. A person's height, circumference, and arm length determined how much fabric to use. Shirts, tunics, and simple dresses used rectangular construction methods, where squares and rectangles of fabric were joined together and then shaped through strategic seaming. The actual cutting process required steady hands and specialized tools. Sharp shears made of iron were used to cut through the fabric, no easy task with thick wool or multiple layers. These shears resembled large scissors but with spring mechanisms that allowed the cutter to apply significant pressure. Mistakes at this stage were costly, so apprentices might spend years practicing before being trusted with valuable fabrics. Once cut, the pieces were joined using a variety of stitches, each with specific purposes. Running stitches created quick seams, while backstitch provided stronger connections for areas under stress. Hem stitches were nearly invisible from the outside, yet secured the edges to prevent fraying. All these stitches were done by hand, with tailors developing calluses and sometimes injuries from years of pushing needles through tough materials. For the common folk, most garments were fairly simple in construction. Tunics, basic dresses, and undergarments used straightforward designs that maximized mobility for work while minimizing fabric waste. These practical garments often featured gussets, triangular or diamond-shaped fabric inserts at stress points like underarms or the sides of garments that allowed freedom of movement while working in fields or workshops. Noble clothing grew increasingly complex throughout the medieval period. By the late Middle Ages, tailoring had become a sophisticated craft, with garments designed to shape and contour the body. Men's clothing evolved to include fitted doublets, padded shoulders, and hose that showcased the leg. Women's gowns featured tightly fitted bodices, voluminous skirts, and intricate sleeves that sometimes reached the floor. The most elaborate garments required multiple fittings. Wealthy customers would visit their tailor several times during the construction process. Each garment was truly bespoke, designed specifically for one person's body and never mass-produced. This custom approach extended the lifespan of garments, with clothes often being altered over time as bodies changed or fashion evolved. Number 4. Dyeing, adding color to medieval life. Think the Middle Ages was all doom and gloom. The fabrics tell a different story. Medieval clothing burst with vibrant colors, from earthy browns to brilliant blues and fiery reds. Dyeing was a messy, smelly, and sometimes dangerous business. Professional dyers worked in dedicated workshops, usually located near rivers or streams for access to water, and let's be honest, to let the pungent odors flow away from town. The stench was so notorious that dyers often had to set up shop in specific districts, sometimes outside city walls. The chemistry behind medieval dyeing would impress modern scientists. Dyers needed to understand complex processes to achieve color-fast results. First, fabrics were prepared with mordant substances like alum, iron, or tannins that helped the dye bind to the fibers. Without these mordants, colors would quickly fade or wash out entirely. Every color came from natural sources, each with its own extraction method. Yellow came relatively easily from plants like weld, saffron, or onion skins. Brown shades were extracted from walnuts, oak galls, or certain tree barks. Getting reds required either madder root or the more expensive kermes insects, which were harvested, dried, and ground into powder. But blue was special. The indigo-producing woad plant turned medieval dyeing into actual alchemy. Fresh woad leaves were harvested, crushed, and formed into balls that fermented until they reached a truly horrific smell. These balls were then dried and processed through a complex fermentation process involving stale urine. Yes, really. The resulting liquid looked yellowish-green until the fabric was lifted out of the dye bath and exposed to oxygen, at which point it magically transformed to blue before everyone's eyes. The most coveted color was purple, traditionally reserved for royalty and high clergy. True purple came from thousands of tiny murex sea snails, each providing just a drop of dye. A single royal purple garment might require millions of these creatures, making it literally worth its weight in gold. For those who couldn't afford true purple, clever dyers developed methods to mimic it by double dyeing fabric with red and blue. Black, despite its seemingly simple appearance, was among the most difficult colors to achieve. It required multiple dyeing processes and often used ingredients like iron and tannic acid that could weaken the fabric over time. This is why medieval black clothing was both expensive and prone to deterioration. Color indicated social status as clearly as any badge or title. Sumptuary laws in many regions restricted who could wear certain colors. Bright scarlet reds, deep blues, and royal purples were often forbidden to commoners, regardless of whether they could afford them. Meanwhile, peasants typically wore clothing in natural wool colors or dyed with whatever affordable materials were locally available, usually yielding browns, tans, yellows, and muted greens. Number 3. Weaving, turning thread into fabric. Did you know medieval people spent more waking hours weaving than doing almost anything else? This crucial step transformed spun thread into usable textiles through a process both artistic and methodical. The heart of medieval weaving was the loom. For ordinary households, the warp-weighted loom stood as a fixture in many homes. This vertical loom used stones or clay weights to tension vertical threads, the warp, while the weaver passed horizontal threads, the weft, between them. Simple, yes. Efficient, not remotely. A basic tunic worth of cloth might take weeks to produce. By the central medieval period, the horizontal loom gained popularity, allowing for faster production and wider fabrics. This technology breakthrough featured a frame where weavers sat and operated foot pedals that raised and lowered different sets of warp threads, creating a space shed for the shuttle carrying the weft thread to pass through. Urban textile centers emerged around these more efficient looms, with entire guilds dedicated to the craft. Weaving patterns ranged from simple to mind-bogglingly complex. The most basic weave, tabby or plain weave, created a strong, uniform fabric by alternately raising and lowering adjacent warp threads. Twill weaves, where the weft passed over one and under two or more warp threads in a staggered pattern, produced diagonal lines in the fabric. Herringbone, diamond twills, and basket weaves offered more decorative options for those with the skill to produce them. For the extremely wealthy, tapestry weaving produced elaborate pictorial designs. Unlike regular weaving, tapestry weaving involved discontinuous wefts with different colored threads working in specific areas of the design. These luxury items often depicted biblical scenes, historical events, or allegorical stories, serving as both insulation on castle walls and status symbols. Tablet weaving, a specialized technique using cards with holes through which warp threads passed, created elaborate bands used for belts, trims, and decorative elements. By rotating the cards in different sequences, weavers could produce intricate patterns that look computer-generated to modern eyes. The fabric's quality varied dramatically based on the weaver's skill and the materials used. Professional weavers in guilds underwent years of apprenticeship before becoming masters. Their fabrics featured even tension, consistent density, and minimal flaws. Household weavers, often women fitting weaving between other duties, typically produced serviceable but simpler cloth. Specialized luxury fabrics like silk, brocades, velvet, and damask required complex looms and extraordinary skill. These were often imported from Byzantine or Islamic regions at enormous expense until European centers in Italy and Flanders began producing their own versions. These fabrics featured multiple thread types, raised patterns, and sometimes incorporated precious metal threads. Weaving was governed by strict regulations in urban areas. Guild systems controlled who could weave commercially, what materials they could use, and even the width of fabrics produced. Officials inspected finished textiles, stamping them with seals of approval that guaranteed quality to buyers. Substandard cloth could be publicly destroyed, and repeat offenders faced fines or expulsion from the guild. Number 2. Spinning from fiber to thread. Have you ever wondered why we call unmarried women spinsters? The answer lies in this crucial step of medieval textile production that consumed countless hours of women's lives. After cleaning and preparation, animal or plant fibers needed to become thread before they could be woven into fabric. This transformation happened through spinning, the process of drawing out fibers and twisting them together to form a continuous strand. This deceptively simple process required significant skill developed over years of practice. The most basic spinning tool, the drop spindle, consisted of a stick with a weighted whorl at one end. The spinner attached prepared fibers to the spindle, then set it spinning while simultaneously drawing out the fibers with their fingers. As the spindle twirled and dropped toward the ground, it twisted the fibers together into thread. Once the spindle reached the ground, the spinner wound the newly formed thread around the shaft and began again. This portable technology allowed women to spin anywhere, while walking, tending children, or socializing. By the High Middle Ages, the spinning wheel arrived in Europe, revolutionizing thread production. The earliest versions, known as great wheels or walking wheels, required spinners to stand and use one hand to turn the large wheel while the other hand drafted the fibers. Later developments added a foot treadle, freeing both hands to manage the fiber. Even with these improvements, spinning remained enormously time-consuming. Producing enough thread for a single garment might take weeks. The quality of thread determined the quality of the final fabric. Skilled spinners could produce thread of remarkable consistency and thickness, which translated to smoother, more even fabric. They could also adjust the amount of twist to create threads suited for different purposes: tightly twisted thread for strength in warp threads, or looser twist for softness in weft threads. Spinning became so synonymous with women's work that it shaped societal expectations and language. Women were expected to bring spinning skills to marriage, with many households depending on female spinning for both domestic use and extra income. Legal records from the period frequently identify women by their spinning abilities. The very tool became metaphorical. The distaff side became synonymous with the female line of a family. For the poorest families, spinning offered one of the few income opportunities available to women. Professional thread merchants would distribute raw fibers to rural households, collecting the spun thread later and paying by weight. This putting out system allowed merchants to avoid guild regulations in cities while giving rural women flexible work they could fit around agricultural and household duties. The thread itself varied tremendously depending on the fiber source. Wool thread, the most common in Northern Europe, ranged from rough, thick yarns for outerwear to fine, soft threads for luxury items. Linen thread made from flax required special preparation but produced strong, smooth thread ideal for undergarments and summer clothing. Cotton thread, relatively rare and expensive in medieval Europe, was primarily imported until later periods. The ultimate luxury, silk thread, came from carefully unraveled silkworm cocoons and demanded extraordinary skill to spin effectively. Number 1. Fiber production, the raw materials. Did you know your medieval outfit began with either a sheep or a plant? The journey from raw material to wearable fabric started with obtaining fibers, a process deeply connected to the agricultural rhythms that governed medieval life. Wool reigned supreme as the most important textile fiber in medieval Europe, especially in northern regions. Sheep breeding became a sophisticated practice, with different varieties raised for specific wool qualities. Some sheep produced coarse wool ideal for hard-wearing outerwear, while others yielded softer fibers suitable for garments worn against the skin. Springtime sheep shearing was a communal affair that brought entire villages together. Using large iron shears, skilled shearers removed the sheep's fleece ideally in one piece. Fresh shorn fleeces were filthy things, full of lanolin, natural sheep oil, dirt, vegetable matter, and parasites. Workers sorted the raw wool by quality, with the finest wool coming from the shoulders and sides. Cleaning wool required multiple steps that would horrify modern environmental regulators. First came washing, often in stale urine collected from chamber pots. The ammonia in urine acted as a natural degreaser to break down the lanolin. After soaking and rinsing in streams or rivers, the wool dried in the sun. Workers then beat the dried wool with sticks to remove remaining debris. Next came the painstaking task of combing or carding. Using large metal combs or wooden paddles covered with metal teeth, workers untangled the fibers and aligned them in the same direction. Different combing methods prepared wool for different types of yarn. Worsted yarn used long, combed fibers aligned parallel to each other, while woolen yarn used shorter fibers arranged more randomly for a fluffier result. Plant fibers followed an entirely different preparation process. Flax, used to make linen, grew in fields alongside food crops. After harvesting, workers tied the plants into bundles and soaked them in ponds or streams for weeks, a process called retting that literally rotted away everything except the tough fibers. The putrid smell of retting pools became a notorious feature of medieval landscapes, often leading to regulations about where these pools could be located. After retting, dried flax stalks were broken using a wooden tool aptly named a brake, which cracked the woody outer parts without damaging the inner fibers. Next came scutching, beating the broken stalks with a wooden knife to separate the fiber from remnants of the stalk. Finally, workers drew the fibers through metal combs of increasing fineness to remove the last bits of debris and align the fibers. This hackling process left long, silk-like strands ready for spinning. Cotton remained relatively uncommon in medieval Europe, primarily imported as a finished fabric rather than grown locally. Silk production, initially a closely guarded Byzantine secret, gradually spread to parts of Spain and Italy. The process involved raising silkworms on mulberry leaves, harvesting their cocoons, and carefully unwinding the incredibly fine filaments without breaking them. Hemp, a cannabis relative without psychoactive properties, provided another important plant fiber. Processed similarly to flax but requiring less finesse, hemp yielded strong fibers primarily used for rope, sacks, and durable outerwear for laborers. For the wealthiest nobility, furs from wild and farmed animals lined winter garments. Fur preparation involved specialized skills in skinning, preserving, and sewing pelts. Rabbit, squirrel, fox, marten, and even ermine stoat provided warmth and status markers, with sumptuary laws often regulating who could wear which types of fur. The very poorest people sometimes used nettle fibers for cloth, harvesting the stinging plants and processing them similarly to flax. This labor-intensive process yielded a surprisingly serviceable fiber when no better options were available. Would you have had the patience for all these steps to create a single outfit? When you couldn't just order a new outfit online, clothing became an investment of months of labor, from the first shearing of a sheep to the final stitch of a garment. Maybe our fast fashion world could learn something from those medieval craftspeople who understood the true value of the clothes on their backs.